Hello friends, my name is JJ, and a while ago I made a video entitled Your City Isn't Unique, in which I documented how a lot of the things that we think make our cities special are not actually very special at all. You see, on this continent at least, big cities are often quite geographically isolated from one another, and one byproduct of this is that people often lack the ability to distinguish a fairly common and generic city thing from something more genuinely particular and special. Although I shouldn't let the Europeans off the hook either. Have you ever seen this Every European City cartoon? Brilliant stuff. Anyway, in the first video, we talked about a number of common things that can be easily found in a ton of American cities, despite the locals often believing these things to be their city's unique special thing. The list included the Old Spaghetti Factory, a Shakespeare, jazz, or folk festival, crazy squirrels on the local college campus, the radio station Kiss FM and annoying diamond commercials on it, and the assumption of having an above average amount of bad drivers and road construction. In the aftermath of that video, I got a ton of great submissions from you guys, detailing many other things that you've noticed city dwellers often heavily sentimentalize as being unique, but really shouldn't, because they're not actually unique at all. Okay, so let us start with one of the big ones, public transit maps. Look, at the end of the day, there is just not that many ways you can draw out the route of a train or subway. You're going to want a bunch of differently colored lines representing the different tracks, punctuated with little white circles representing the stops. For space reasons, it can't be completely geographically accurate, and we'll have to prioritize readability instead. On that note, for the text, you will probably want to use a super clean font like Helvetica. This is all very common sense stuff, but nevertheless, I have noticed that many cities across this continent, and even around the world, seem to genuinely believe that their transit maps are some unique masterpiece of graphic design brilliance, even to the point of selling magnets and tea towels and throw pillows featuring the colored lines and dots and Helvetica's station names. Maybe the local paper can even wheel out the guy who designed the map several decades ago so he can go on about how, well, the thing about my transit map is that it's not geographically accurate, but was designed for readability. Alright, next up we have a great one by my friend Celeb Alert, who writes, people in cities are like, oh yeah, our city is built over the tunnels. I guess this is just a specific coincidence that has happened in our particular city. Every city is like this. Yes, I have noticed this many times as well. This is something that a lot of folks seem genuinely delighted by. The idea that their city, as big as it is actually even bigger beneath the surface due to some elaborate network of secret tunnels that most people don't know about, but are actually very cool and mysterious. I mean, I've never seen them myself, but you gotta believe me, bro! Seriously, rumors of this sort seem to be one of the most common secrets any large urban city has, and that's because, as it turns out, there are actually plenty of perfectly predictable reasons why a city might have a substantial underground area. It could be an area that was specifically built to supplement something to do with the city's plumbing, sewage, or heating infrastructure. It could be remnants of some older portion of the city that was destroyed by a natural disaster and then built over. It could be a leftover system of passageways that once linked various buildings for the purpose of transporting people or goods. It could be remnants of some abandoned subway system. Really, the possibilities are endless. Now, in many big cities, their underground areas have fallen into disrepair and are now used primarily for those spooky haunted city tours you always see advertised, but no one actually goes on. But there's this whole other subset of North American cities that are home to maze-like underground areas that are still widely used to this day, full of shops and things like that can be easily accessed by the public. Locals will often rationalize these things as having been specifically designed for their city in order to help their residents escape their city's uniquely bad weather, be it hot or cold. But in reality, underground retail areas were just kind of a short-lived fad in commercial real estate during the 70s and 80s that have now fallen out of fashion. I feel like trends in general tend to confuse a lot of people when it comes to figuring out what makes a city special or not. It can often be difficult to distinguish a fad that is a product of local circumstances from one that is sweeping the whole continent more broadly. For example, I grew up hearing that Vancouver culture was defined by our love of two very particular fast foods: pizza by the slice and bubble tea. The omnipresence of bubble tea shops was presented as reflecting the cultural power of this city's uniquely special Asian immigrant community, while the cheap pizza slices supposedly symbolized how we have this big culture of drunken party people who roam the streets on Friday night and eat any old garbage so long as it's convenient and the price is right. When we got the Olympics in 2010, I remember there was even a cartoon in the newspaper suggesting that Vancouver's official mascot should be like a crappy slice of pizza or a bubble tea man. But of course, I have since learned that these two foodstuffs are actually incredibly common fast food staples sold by big chain franchises all over North America, from Boston to Bismarck. Which, I mean, only makes sense because at the end of the day, these are pretty basic dopaminergic street foods, high in salt and fat and sugar, and that type of thing usually transcends any other variable of local culture when determining what type of cuisine catches on. And speaking of ethnic cuisine, here is a good nominee from my friend Matthew: the Irish pub. I am from New York City, which had a large number of immigrants from Ireland, and I grew up assuming that the many Irish pubs were an artifact of this immigrant community. Then I went to places that didn't have a lot of Irish immigrants and found pubs that were identical in every detail. It turns out that they are sold as prefab kits, so you can set up an authentic Irish pub anywhere in the world. See, where I come from, there are very few Irish immigrants, so I'm actually feeling a kind of reverse shock in reading this. You mean some cities have their tacky Irish pubs run by actual Irishmen? But it's true. If there is one thing that I have learned you should always be suspicious of the authenticity of, it is crazy crap-on-the-wall restaurants. They are just so easy to fake. And speaking of prefabricated things, let me tell you about a common phenomena that I really disappointed a friend of mine the other day by revealing. Okay, so have you ever walked past a church in some downtown neighborhood and seen that they have a statue of like a beggar out front? But then when you look closely at his outstretched hand, you see that there's a hole in it, meaning that he is not in fact a beggar at all, but rather Jesus Christ himself? Wow, really makes you think, eh? What a uniquely thoughtful Christian leadership we have in this city. People often think that this statue is a very brilliantly provocative piece of public art, and maybe it is, but it is also a very common piece of public art. The Jesus the Beggar sculpture, along with a similar one of Jesus as a homeless guy sleeping on a bench, was designed by an artist from Toronto named Timothy Schmaltz, who has sold replicas to churches in over 100 different cities around the world. These things are getting so common, in fact, that on my recent travels, I had the experience of seeing two of them at two different churches in the same downtown area, just a few blocks apart. In other words, a piece of art that exists to offer a commentary on things that people carelessly ignore might be in danger of getting so common, it's becoming easy to carelessly ignore. All right, so here is another one a number of you guys brought up in various ways, which is the beloved local weirdo. I can give you a good anecdote about this one as well. So there is a podcast that I'm quite fond of called Jordan, Jesse, Go. And one of the gimmicks of this show is that people send Jordan and Jesse stories about momentous occasions they've had in their life recently, which are usually stories of wacky things that they've seen or done. You know, like, oh, I saw a chihuahua fighting an iguana in the Walmart parking lot or whatever. But after a while, all of the momentous occasions started to drift into the same sort of stories, which was, you guys have got to hear about this crazy guy who wanders the streets of my city. And it would be like a guy who strolls around belting out opera songs while wearing a Viking hat, or a guy with a 3-foot mohawk who hobbles around on stilts, or a guy with face tattoos and a yellow boa constrictor, or a guy in a bear costume who cruises around on roller skates. And at some point, these sorts of momentous occasions were getting so predictable and repetitive and boring that Jordan and Jesse had to institute a no beloved local weirdos rule to the segment. And the moral of this story is that beloved local weirdos are a great deal less remarkable than they often appear. There will always be a certain class of person who craves public attention for one reason or another, and will find a way of getting it. The downtown cores of cities, likewise, are always packed with people, making them the ideal captive audience for those eager to be noticed. Ergo, zany and flamboyant characters are a part of urban life as generic as sky-high rent. To cite another thing many of you said you are tired of hearing people complain about as their city's unique problem. But you know what most cities seem to agree is decidedly not a problem? Their water quality. Growing up in Vancouver, I was constantly told that we had the cleanest water in the world, to the point where it was considered offensively decadent and wasteful for a Vancouverite to ever drink a bottle of Evian or whatever. And as a result of this, for a long time, whenever I traveled, I would often be very resistant to drinking the tap water of other cities because I was sure that their gross, non-Vancouver water would ruin my insides. But I've since learned that an awful lot of cities hold their water in similarly high regard. Just by Googling some version of the phrase cleanest water in America or cleanest water in Canada, I learned that the cleanest drinking water on this continent can apparently be found in New York, Portland, San Francisco, Cleveland, Calgary, Birmingham, Butte, Hampton, Memphis, Lake Tahoe, Winnipeg, Denver, Dayton, Quebec City, Louisville, Seattle, Miami. So I think the big takeaway here is that if you are traveling across this continent and get thirsty, just drink the tap water, you'll be fine. And talking of water, my friend Ian makes an insightful observation. I've noticed many cities seem to think that being on a river is a defining feature of their city's geography, when the vast majority of cities are located near some kind of river. This is something that has only recently become blindingly obvious to me as well. If you look at one of those artisanal hipster minimalist maps of a city, which are themselves a deeply common urban cliche, you'll see that if any city isn't built around the coast of an ocean, it is built around the coast of a river. Which only makes sense because, I mean, as a matter of history, cities on this continent were usually initially built up along trade and travel routes, and waterways have traditionally been our main way of moving goods and people. But our collective amnesia about this really tends to make a lot of cities overly sentimentalize aspects of living by a waterway that is really pretty universal to all cities. The main example would of course be making a totem of the bridge that goes over it. But I often feel like complaining about the waterfront is a close second. An awful lot of cities have this ingrained culture of bitching about how not enough is being done with the waterfront in terms of it not having enough trendy pubs or patios or whatever. And this is often spoken of as some great tragedy because, of course, the waterfront is seen as some uniquely remarkable asset that would surely draw in crowds of tourists if only this city's leaders could get their heads out of their yada yada. The possibility that a waterfront might not actually be such a hot draw because a lot of tourists will be coming from cities that have waterfronts of their own is a conclusion rarely drawn. But that said, of course, some lucky cities do get their act together on this front, which is why the only thing more common than an underperforming waterfront is a revitalized waterfront. You may recall this even being a plot point in an old episode of The Simpsons. All right, now, even though I do think that the culture of American and Canadian cities are more alike than not, especially when it comes to the sort of stuff that we are talking about today, my friend Daniel tells me about a boringly common city thing that seems to be pretty particularly American, the Doughboy statue. So apparently this statue of a World War I soldier with his hand in the air is something that a lot of Americans believe to be a special memorial to their community's war dead, built specifically for them. But as I am sure you can tell by now, no, it ain't. According to Atlas Obscura, the Doughboy statue is much like the Hobo Jesus statue in that it was made by a single guy, an artist named E.M. Vicani, who shortly after the First World War started a very successful business churning out what are believed to be the first known mass-produced memorials in existence. They were made using molten metal and a mold, which was a bold technical innovation in the statue-making industry at the time, and sold to basically any city hall or veterans group that wanted one. Atlas Obscura estimates that there are about 145 of them across America in all. And lastly, I just wanted to close with another comment from another friend named Matthew. Embodying the role soul of a generic city dweller, Matthew proclaims, I'm sure you can imagine that we are all quite fond of our own special list of establishments. The axe throwing place, the Kobe beef restaurant, the escape room, the comic book shop, the glass ornament shop, the LGBT bookstore, and of course, the iconic bridge. So, what other city things are overrated? What have you been surprised to learn is less unique about your city than you once assumed? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.